20th of June, 1747. En route to London, I reread an old journal. Why? Some instinct, perhaps. Some subconscious nagging doubt, I suppose. Whatever it was, when I reread the entry of 10th of December, 1735, I all of a sudden knew exactly what I had to do when I reached England. 2nd to 3rd of July, 1747. Today was the service, and also, well, I shall explain. After the service, I left Reginald talking to Mr. Simpkin on the steps of the chapel. To me, Mr. Simpkin said that he had some papers for me to sign. In the light of Mother's death, the finances were mine. With an obsequious smile, he said he hoped that I had considered him more than satisfactory in managing the affairs so far. I nodded, smiled, said nothing committal, told them I wanted a little time to myself, and slipped away, seemingly to be alone with my thoughts. I hoped that the direction of my wanderings looked random as I made my way along the thoroughfare, staying clear of carriage wheels that splashed through mud and manure on the highway, weaving through people thronging the streets, tradesmen in bloodied leather aprons, whores and washerwomen. But it wasn't. It wasn't random at all. One woman in particular was up ahead, like me, making her way through the crowds, alone and probably lost in thought. I had seen her at the service, of course. She'd sat with the other staff, Emily and 2 or 3 others I didn't recognize, on the other side of the chapel, with a handkerchief at her nose. She had looked up and seen me. She must have done. But she made no sign. I wondered, did Betty, my old nursemaid, even recognize me? And now I was following her, keeping a discreet distance behind so she wouldn't see me if she happened to glance backwards. It was getting dark by the time she reached home. Or not home, but the household for which she now worked, a grand mansion that loomed in the charcoal sky, not too dissimilar to the one at Queen Anne's Square. Was she still a nursemaid, I wondered, or had she moved up in the world? Did she wear the uniform of a governess beneath her coat? The street was less crowded than before, and I lingered out of sight, watching as she took a short flight of stone steps down towards the below-stairs quarters, and let herself in. When she was out of sight, I crossed the highway and sauntered towards the house, aware of the need to look inconspicuous in case eyes were seeing me from the windows. Once upon a time I was a young boy who had looked from the windows of the house in Queen Anne's Square, watched passers-by come and go, and wondered about their business. Was there a little boy in this household watching me now, wondering who is this man? Where has he come from? Where is he going? So I wandered along the railings at the front of the mansion, and glanced down to see the lit windows of what I assumed were the servants' quarters, only to be rewarded with the unmistakable silhouette of Betty appearing at the glass and drawing a curtain. I had the information I'd come for. I returned after midnight, when the drapes at the windows of the mansion were shut, the street was dark, and the only lights were those fixed to the occasional passing carriage. Once again I made my way to the front of the house, and with a quick look left and right, scaled the railings and dropped silently down into the gully on the other side. I scuttled along it until I found Betty's window, where I stopped and very carefully placed my ear to the glass, listening for some moments until I was satisfied that there was no movement from within. And then, with infinite patience, I applied my fingertips to the bottom of the sash window and lifted, praying it wouldn't squeak, and, when my prayers were answered, letting myself in and closing the window behind me. In the bed she stirred slightly, at the breath of air from the open window, perhaps. Some unconscious sensing of my presence? Like a statue I stood and waited for her deep breathing to resume, and felt the air around me settle, my incursion absorbed into the room, so that after a few moments it was as though I were a part of it, as though I had always been a part of it, like a ghost. And then I took out my sword. It was fitting, ironic, perhaps, that it should have been the sword given to me by my father. These days I rarely go anywhere without it. Years ago, Reginald asked me when I expected it to taste blood, and it has, of course, many times. And if I was right about Betty, then it would once again. I sat on the bed and put the blade of the sword close to her throat, then clamped my hand over her mouth. She woke. Immediately her eyes were wide with terror. Her mouth moved and my palm tickled and vibrated as she tried to scream. I held her thrashing body still and said nothing, just allowed her eyes to adjust until she could see me. And she must have recognized me. How could she not, when she nursed me for 10 years, was like a mother to me? How can she not have recognized Master Hightam? When she had finished struggling, I whispered, "Hello, Betty," with my hand still over her mouth. "I have something I need to ask you. To answer, you will need to speak. For you to speak, I'll need to take my hand from your mouth, and you may be tempted to scream. But if you scream—" I applied the tip of the sword to her throat to make my point. And then, very gently, I lifted my hand from her mouth. Her eyes were hard, like granite. For a moment I felt myself retreat to childhood, and was almost intimidated by the fire and fury there, as though the sight of them triggered a memory of being scolded that I couldn't help but respond to. "I should put you over my knee for this, Master Hightam," she hissed. "How dare you creep into a lady's room when she sleeps? Did I teach you nothing? Did Edith teach you nothing? Your mother?" Her voice was rising. "Did your father teach you nothing?" That childhood feeling stayed with me, and I had to reach into myself to find resolve, fighting an urge simply to put away my sword and say, "Sorry, Nurse Betty, promise never to do it again, that I will be a good boy from now on." The thought of my father gave me that resolve. "It's true you were like a mother to me once, Betty," I said to her. "It's true that what I'm doing is a terrible, unforgivable thing to do. Believe me, I'm not here lightly. But what you've done is terrible and unforgivable too." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" With my other hand I reached inside my frock coat and retrieved a folded piece of paper, which I held for her to see in the near dark of the room. "You remember Laura, the kitchen maid?" Cautious, she nodded. "She sent me a letter," I went on. "A letter that told me all about your relationship with Digweed. For how long was Father's gentleman your fancy man, Betty?" There was no such letter. The piece of paper I held contained nothing more revelatory than the address of my lodgings for the night, and I was relying on the low light to fool her. The truth was that when I'd reread my old journals, I'd been taken back to that moment many, many years ago, when I'd gone to look for Betty. She had been having her little lie-in that cold morning, and when I peered through her keyhole I'd seen a pair of men's boots in her room. I hadn't realized at the time because I was too young. I'd seen them with the eyes of a 9-year-old and thought nothing of them. Not then, not ever since. Not until reading it afresh, when, like a joke that suddenly makes sense, I had understood. The boots had belonged to her lover. Of course they had. What I was less certain of was that her lover was Digweed. I remember that she used to speak of him with great affection, but then so did everyone. He had fooled us all. But when I left for Europe in the care of Reginald, Digweed had found alternative employment for Betty. Even so, it was a guess that they were lovers. A considered, educated guess, but risky, with terrible consequences if I was wrong. Do you remember the day you had a little lie-in, Betty? I asked. A little lie-in. Do you remember? She nodded her head warily. I came to see where you were, I continued. I was cold, you see. And in the passage outside your room, well, I don't like to admit it, but I knelt down and I looked through your keyhole. I felt myself colour slightly, despite everything. She'd been staring balefully up at me, but now her eyes went flinty and her lips pursed crossly, almost as though this ancient intrusion were as bad as the current one. I didn't see anything, I clarified quickly. Not unless you count you slumbering in bed, and also a pair of men's boots that I recognized as belonging to Digweed. Were you having an affair with him? Is that it? Oh, Master Hightam, she whispered, shaking her head and with sad eyes. What has become of you? What sort of man has that Birch turned you into? That you should be holding a knife to the throat of a lady of my advancing years is bad enough. Oh, that's bad enough. But look at you now. You're ladling hurt on hurt, accusing me of having an affair, being a home-wrecker. It was no affair. Mr. Digweed had children, that's true, who were looked after by his sister in Herefordshire. But his wife died many years before he even joined the household. Ours was not an affair the way you're thinking with your dirty mind. We were in love. And shame on you thinking otherwise. Shame on you. She shook her head again. Feeling my hand tighten on the handle of the sword, I squeezed my eyes shut. No, it's not me who should be made to feel at fault here. You can try and come high and mighty with me all you like, but the fact is that you had a relationship of some kind, of whatever kind, it doesn't matter what kind, with Digweed, and Digweed betrayed us. Without that betrayal, my father would be alive, Mother would be alive, and I would not be sitting here with a knife to your throat, so don't blame me for your current predicament, Betty. Blame him. She took a deep breath and composed herself. He had no choice, she said at last. Jack didn't. Oh, that was his name, by the way. Jack. Did you know that? I'll read it on his gravestone, I hissed. And knowing it makes not a blind bit of difference, because he did have a choice, Betty. Whether it was a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea, I don't care. He had a choice. No. The man threatened Jack's children. Man? What man? I don't know. A man who first spoke to Jack in town. Did you ever see him? No. What did Digweed say about him? Was he from the West Country? Jack said he had the accent, sir, yes. Why? When the men kidnapped Jenny, she was screaming about a traitor. Violet from next door heard her, but the following day a man with a West Country accent came to speak to her, to warn her not to tell anyone what she'd heard. West Country. Betty had blanched, I saw. What? I snapped. What have I said? It's Violet, sir, she gasped. Not long after you left for Europe. It could even have been the day after. She met her end in a street robbery. They came good on their word, I said. I looked at her. Tell me about the man giving Digweed his orders, I said. Nothing. Jack never said anything about him. That he meant business. That if Jack didn't do as they told him, then they would find his children and kill them. They said that if he told the master, then they'd find his boys, cut them and kill them slowly, all of that. They told him what they were planning to do to the house, but on my life, Master Hightam, they told him that nobody would be hurt, that it would all happen at the dead of night. Something occurred to me. Why did they even need him? She looked perplexed. He wasn't even there on the night of the attack, I continued. It wasn't as if they required help getting in. They took Jenny, killed father. Why was Digweed needed for that? I don't know, Master Hightam, she said. I really don't. When I looked down at her, it was with a kind of numbness. Before, when I'd been waiting for darkness to fall, anger had been simmering, bubbling within me. The idea of Digweed's treachery lighting a fire beneath my fury. The idea that Betty had colluded, or even known, adding fuel to it. I'd wanted her to be innocent. Most of all, I'd wanted her dalliance to be with another member of the household. But if it was with Digweed, then I wanted her to know nothing about his betrayal. I wanted her to be innocent, for if she was guilty, then I had to kill her, because if she could have done something to stop the slaughter of that night and failed to act, then she had to die. That was justice. It was cause and effect, checks and balances, an eye for an eye, and that's what I believe in. That's my ideology. A way of negotiating a passage through life that makes sense even when life itself so rarely does. A way of imposing order upon chaos. But the last thing I wanted to do was kill her. Where is he now? I asked softly. I don't know, Master Hightam. Her voice quavered with fear. The last time I heard from him was the morning he disappeared. Who else knew you and he were lovers? Nobody, she replied. We were always so careful. Apart from leaving his boots in view. They were moved sharpish. Her eyes hardened. And most folk weren't in the habit of peering through the keyhole. There was a pause. What happens now, Master Hightam? She said, a catch in her voice. I should kill you, Betty, I said simply. And looking into her eyes, I saw the realization dawn on her that I could if I wanted to. That I was capable of doing it. She whimpered. I stood. But I won't. There's already been too much death as a result of that night. We will not meet again. For your years of service and nurture, I award you your life and leave you with your shame. Goodbye. 14th of July, 1747. 1. After neglecting my journal for almost 2 weeks, I have much to tell, and should recap, going right back to the night I visited Betty. After leaving, I'd returned to my lodgings, slept for a few fitful hours, then rose, dressed, and took a carriage back to her house. There I bid the driver wait some distance away, close enough to see, but not close enough to draw suspicion, and as he snoozed, grateful for the rest, I sat and gazed out of the window, and waited. For what? I didn't know for sure. Yet again I was listening to my instinct. And yet again it proved correct, for not long after daybreak, Betty appeared. I dismissed the driver, followed her on foot, and sure enough, she made her way to the General Post Office on Lombard Street, went in, reappeared some minutes later, and then made her way back along the street until she was swallowed up by the crowds. I watched her go, feeling nothing. Not the urge to follow her and slit her throat for her treachery, not even the vestiges of the affection we once had. Just nothing. Instead, I took up position in a doorway and watched the world go by, flicking beggars and street sellers away with my cane as I waited for perhaps an hour until... Yes, there he was. The letter carrier, carrying his bell and case full of mail. I pushed myself out of the doorway and, twirling my cane, followed him, closer and closer until he moved on to a side road where there were fewer pedestrians, and I spotted my chance. Moments later, I was kneeling by his bleeding and unconscious body in an alleyway, sorting through the contents of his letter case until I found it, an envelope addressed to Jack Digweed. I read it. It said that she loved him, and that I had found out about their relationship. Nothing in there I didn't already know. But it wasn't the content of the letter I was interested in so much as the destination. And there it was on the front of the envelope, which was bound for the Black Forest, for a small town called St. Peter, not far from Freiburg. Almost 2 weeks of journeying later, Reginald and I came within sight of St. Peter in the distance, a cluster of buildings nestled at the bottom of a valley, otherwise rich with verdant fields and patches of forest. That was this morning. 2. We reached it at around noon, dirty and tired from our travels. Trotting slowly through narrow, labyrinthine streets, I saw the upturned faces of the residents, glimpsed either from pathways or turning quickly away from windows, closing doors and drawing curtains. We had death on our minds, and at the time I thought they somehow knew this, or perhaps were easily spooked. What I didn't know was that we weren't the first strangers to ride into town that morning. The townspeople were already spooked. The letter had been addressed care of the St. Peter General Store. We came to a small plaza with a fountain shaded by chestnut trees, and asked for directions from a nervous townswoman. Others gave us a wide berth as she pointed the way, then sidled off, staring at her shoes. Moments later we were tethering our horses outside the store, and walking in, only for the sole customer to take a look at us, and decide to stock up on provisions another time. Reginald and I exchanged a confused look. Then I cast an eye over the store. Tall wooden shelves lined 3 sides, stocked with jars and packets tied up with twine, while at the back was a high counter behind which stood the storekeeper, wearing an apron, a wide moustache, and a smile that had faded like an exhausted candle on getting a good look at us. To my left was a set of steps used to reach the high shelves. On them sat a boy, about 10 years old, the storekeeper's son by the look of him. He almost lost his footing in his haste to scuttle off the steps and stand in the middle of the floor with his hands by his side awaiting his orders. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," said the shopkeeper in German. "You look like you've been riding a long time. You need some supplies to continue your journey." He indicated an urn on the counter before him. "You need some refreshments, perhaps? A drink?" Next he was waving a hand at the boy. "Christoph, have you forgotten your manners? Take the gentlemen's coats." There were 3 stools in front of the counter, and the shopkeeper waved a hand at them, saying, Please, take a seat." I glanced again at Reginald, saw he was about to move forward to accept the storekeeper's offer of hospitality, and stopped him. "No, thank you," I said to the shopkeeper. "My friend and I don't intend to stay." From the corner of my eye I saw Reginald's shoulders sag, but he said nothing. "All we need from you is information," I added. A cautious look fell across the shopkeeper's face, like a dark curtain. "Yes," he said warily. "We need to find a man. His name is Digweed. Jack Digweed. Are you acquainted with him?" He shook his head. "You don't know him at all?" I pressed. Again the shake of the head. "Hightam," said Reginald, as though he could read my mind from the tone of my voice. I ignored him. "Are you quite sure about that?" I insisted. "Yes, sir," said the shopkeeper. His moustache quivered nervously. He swallowed. I felt my jaw tighten. Then, before anybody had a chance to react, I'd drawn my sword and with my outstretched arm tucked the blade beneath Christoph's chin. The boy gasped, raised himself on his tiptoes, and his eyes darted as the blade pressed into his throat. I hadn't taken my eyes off the shopkeeper. "Hi, Tam," said Reginald again. "Let me handle this, please, Reginald," I said, and addressed the storekeeper. "Digweed's letters are sent care of this address," I said. "Let me ask you again. Where is he?" "Sir," pleaded the shopkeeper. His eyes darted from me to Christoph, who was making a series of low noises as though he were finding it difficult to swallow. "Please don't hurt my son." His pleas fell on deaf ears. "Where is he?" I repeated. "Sir," pleaded the owner, his hands implored, "I cannot say." With a tiny flick of the wrist, I increased the pressure of my blade on Christoph's throat, and was rewarded with a whimper. From the corner of my eye I saw the boy rise even higher on his tiptoes, and felt, but did not see, Reginald's discomfort to the other side of me. All the time my eyes never left those of the shopkeeper. "Please, sir, he said quickly, those imploring hands waving in the air, as though he were trying to juggle an invisible glass. "I can't say. I was warned not to." "Aha," I said. Who warned you? Was it him? Was it Digweed?" "No, sir," insisted the shopkeeper. "I haven't seen Master Digweed for some weeks. This was someone else. But I can't tell you. I can't tell you who. These men, they were serious." "But I think we know that I, too, am serious," I said with a smile. "And the difference between them and me is that I am here and they are not. Now tell me, how many men, who were they, and what did they want to know?" His eyes flicked from me to Christoph, who, though brave and stoic and displaying the kind of fortitude under duress that I'd hoped for my own son, whimpered again none the less, which must have made up the storekeeper's mind, because his moustache trembled a little more. Then he spoke, quickly, the words tumbling from him. "They were here, sir," he said, "just an hour or so ago, 2 men with long black coats over the red tunics of the British Army, who came into the store just as you did and asked the whereabouts of Master Digweed. When I told them, thinking little of it, they became very grave, sir, and told me that some more men might arrive looking for Master Digweed, and if they did, then I was to deny all knowledge of him on pain of death, and not to say that they had been here." "Where is he?" "A cabin, 15 miles north of here in the woods." Neither Reginald nor I said a word. We both knew we didn't have a minute to spare, and without pausing to make more threats or to say goodbye, or perhaps even apologize to Christoph for frightening him half to death, we both dashed out of the door, untethered and mounted our steeds, and spurred them on with yells. We rode as hard as we dared for over half an hour, until we had covered maybe 8 miles of pasture, all of it uphill, our horses now becoming tired. We came to a tree line only to discover that it was a narrow band of pine, and we arrived on the other side to see a ribbon of trees stretching around the summit of a hill on either side. Meanwhile, in front of us the ground sloped down into more woodland, then away, undulating like a huge blanket of green, patched with forestry, grass, and fields. We pulled up, and I called for the spyglass. Our horses snorted, and I scanned the area in front of us, swinging the spyglass from left to right, crazily at first, with the emergency getting the better of me, panic making me indiscriminate. In the end I had to force myself to calm down, taking deep breaths and screwing up my eyes tight, then starting again, this time moving the spyglass slowly and methodically across the landscape. In my head I divided the territory into a grid and moved from one square to another, back to being systematic and efficient, back to having logic in charge, not emotion. A silence of gentle wind and birdsong was broken by Reginald. "Would you have done it?" "Done what, Reginald?" He meant kill the child. "Kill the boy. Would you have done it?" "There is little point in making a threat if you can't carry it out. The storekeeper would have known if I was shamming. He would have seen it in my eyes. He would have known." Reginald shifted uneasily in his saddle. "So, yes, then. Yes, you would have killed him." "That's right, Reginald, I would have killed him." There was a pause. I completed the next square of land, then the next. "When was the killing of innocents ever part of your teaching, Hightam?" said Reginald. I gave a snort. "Just because you taught me to kill, Reginald, it doesn't give you the final say on whom I kill and to what end. I taught you honor. I taught you a code. I remember you, Reginald, about to dispense your own form of justice outside White's all those years ago. Was that honourable?" Did he redden slightly? Certainly he shifted uncomfortably on his horse. "The man was a thief," he said. "The men I seek are murderers, Reginald." "Even so," he said, with a touch of irritation, "perhaps your zeal is clouding your judgment." Again I gave a contemptuous snort. "This from you? Is your fascination with those who came before, strictly speaking, in line with Templar policy?" "Of course." "Really? Are you sure you haven't been neglecting your other duties in favour of it? What letter writing, what journaling, what reading have you been doing lately, Reginald?" "Plenty," he said indignantly. "That hasn't been connected with those who came before," I added. For a moment he blustered, sounding like a red-faced fat man given the wrong meat at dinner. "I'm here now, aren't I?" "Indeed, Reginald," I said, just as I saw a tiny plume of smoke coming from the woodland. "I see smoke in the trees, possibly from a cabin. We should head for there." At the same time there was a movement not far away in a crop of fir trees, and I saw a rider heading up the furthest hill away from us. "Look, Reginald, there. Do you see him?" I adjusted the focus. The rider had his back to us, of course, and was a distance away, but one thing I thought I could see was his ears. I was sure he had pointed ears. "I see one man, Hightam, but where is the other?" said Reginald. Already pulling on the reins of my steed, I said, "Still in the cabin, Reginald. Let's go." 3. It was perhaps another 20 minutes before we arrived. 20 minutes during which I pushed my steed to her limit, risking her through trees and over wind-fallen branches, leaving Reginald behind as I raced towards where I'd seen the smoke, to the cabin where I was sure I'd find Digweed. Alive? Dead? I didn't know. But the storekeeper had said there were 2 men asking for him, and we'd only accounted for one of them, so I was eager to know about the other one. Had he gone on ahead? Or was he still in the cabin? There it was, sitting in the middle of a clearing. A squat wooden building, 1 horse tethered outside, with a single window at the front and tendrils of smoke puffing from the chimney. The front door was open, wide open. At the same time as I came bolting into the clearing, I heard a scream from inside, and I spurred my steed to the door, drawing my sword. With a great clatter we came onto the boards at the front of the house, and I craned forward in my saddle to see the scene inside. Digweed was tied to a chair, shoulders sagging, head tilted. His face was a mask of blood, but I could see that his lips were moving. He was alive, and standing over him was the second man, holding a blood-stained knife, a knife with a curved, serrated blade, and about to finish the job. About to slit Digweed's throat. I'd never used my sword as a spear before, and take it from me, it's a far from ideal use for it. But at that exact moment my priority was keeping Digweed alive. I needed to speak to him, and besides, nobody was going to kill Digweed but me. So I threw it. It was all I had time to do. And though my throw had as little power as it did aim, it hit the knife man's arm just as the blade arced down, and it was enough to send him staggering back with a howl of pain, at the same time as I threw myself off the horse, landed on the boards inside of the cabin, rolled forward, and snatched out my short sword at the same time. And it had been enough to save Digweed. I landed right by him. Blood-stained rope kept his arms and legs tied to the chair. His clothes were torn and black with blood, his face swollen and bleeding. His lips still moved. His eyes slid lazily over to see me, and I wondered what he thought in the brief moment that he took me in. Did he recognize me? Did he feel a bolt of guilt, or a flash of hope? Then my eyes went to a back window, only to see the knife man's legs disappearing through it, as he squeezed himself out and fell with a thump to the ground outside. To follow through the window meant putting myself in a vulnerable position. I didn't fancy being stuck in the frame while the knife man had all the time in the world to plunge his blade into me. So instead, I ran to the front door and back into the clearing to give chase. Reginald was just arriving. He'd seen the knife man, had a better view of him than I did, and was already taking aim with his bow. "Don't kill him!" I roared, just as he fired, and he howled in displeasure as the arrow went wide. "Damn you, man, I had him!" he shouted. "He's in the trees now!" I'd rounded the front of the cabin in time, feet kicking up a carpet of dead and dry pine needles just in time to see the knife man disappear into the tree line. "I need him alive, Reginald," I shouted back at him. "Digweed's in the cabin. Keep him safe until I return." And with that I burst into the trees, leaves and branches whipping my face as I thundered on, short sword in hand. Ahead of me I saw a dark shape in the foliage, crashing through it with as little grace as I was. Or perhaps less grace, because I was gaining on him. "Were you there?" I shouted at him. "Were you there the night they killed my father?" "I didn't have that pleasure, boy," he called back over his shoulder. "How I wish I had been. I did my bit, though. I was the fixer." Of course. He had a West Country accent. Now, who had been described as having a West Country accent? The man who had blackmailed Digweed. The man who had threatened Violet and shown her an evil-looking knife. "Stand and face me," I shouted. "You're so keen for Kenway blood, let's see if you can't spill mine." I was nimbler than he was, faster and closer now. I'd heard the wheeze in his voice when he spoke to me, and it was only a matter of time before I caught him. He knew it, and rather than tire himself further, he decided to turn and fight, hurdling one final wind-fallen branch, which brought him into a small clearing, spinning about, the curved blade in his hand. The curved, serrated, evil-looking blade. His face was grizzled and terribly pockmarked, as though scarred from some childhood disease. He breathed heavily as he wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. He'd lost his hat in the chase, revealing close-cropped, greying hair, and his coat, dark just as the storekeeper had described it, was torn, fluttering open to reveal his red army tunic. "You're a British soldier," I said. "That's the uniform I wear," he sneered. "But my allegiances lie elsewhere." "Indeed, do they? To whom do you swear loyalty then?" I asked. "Are you an assassin?" He shook his head. I'm my own man, boy. Something you can only dream of being. It's a long time since anybody's called me boy, I said. You think you've made a name for yourself, Hightam Kenway? The killer? The Templar Blade Man? Because you killed a couple of fat merchants? But to me, you're a boy. You're a boy because a man faces his targets man to man. He doesn't steal up behind him in the dead of night like a snake. He paused. Like an assassin. He began to swap his knife from one hand to the other. The effect was almost hypnotic, or at least that's what I let him believe. You think I can't fight? I said. You're yet to prove it. Here's as good a place as any. He spat and beckoned me forward with one hand, rolling the blade in the other. Come on, he goaded me. Come be a warrior for the first time. Come see what it feels like. Come on, boy, be a man. It was supposed to anger me, but instead it made me focus. I needed him alive. I needed him to talk. I leapt over the branch and into the clearing, swinging a little wildly to push him back, but recovering my stance quickly before he could press forward with a counter-attack of his own. For some moments we circled one another, each waiting for the other to launch his next attack. I broke the stalemate by lunging forward, slashing, then instantly retreating to my guard. For a second he thought I'd missed. Then he felt the blood begin to trickle down his cheek, and touched a hand to his face, his eyes widening in surprise. First blood to me. You've underestimated me, I said. His smile was a little more strained this time. There won't be a second time. There will be, I replied, and came forward again, feinting towards the left, then going right when his body was already committed to the wrong line of defence. A gash opened up in his free arm. Blood stained his tattered sleeve and began dripping to the forest floor, bright red on brown and green needles. I'm better than you know, I said. All you have to look forward to is death, unless you talk. Unless you tell me everything you know. Who are you working for? I danced forward and slashed as his knife flailed wildly. His other cheek opened. There were now 2 scarlet ribbons on the brown leather of his face. Why was my father killed? I came forward again, and this time sliced the back of his knife hand. If I'd been hoping he'd drop the knife, then I was disappointed. If I'd been hoping to give him a demonstration of my skills, then that's exactly what I'd done, and it showed on his face. His now bloody face. He wasn't grinning any more. But he still had fight in him, and when he came forward it was fast and smooth, and he swapped his knife from one hand to the other to try to misdirect me, and almost made contact. Almost. He might even have done it, if he hadn't already showed me that particular trick, if he hadn't been slowed down by the injuries I'd inflicted on him. As it was, I ducked easily beneath his blade and struck upwards, burying my own in his flank. Immediately I was cursing, though. I'd hit him too hard and in the kidney. He was dead. The internal bleeding would kill him in around 30 minutes, but he could pass out straight away. Whether he knew it himself or not, I don't know, for he was coming at me again, his teeth bared. They were coated with blood now, I noticed, and I swung easily away, took hold of his arm, twisted into his body, and broke it at the elbow. The sound he made wasn't a scream so much as an anguished inhalation, and as I crunched the bones in his arm, more for effect than for any useful purpose, his knife dropped to the forest floor with a soft thump, and he followed it, sinking to his knees. I let go of his arm, which dropped limply, a bag of broken bones and skin. Looking down, I could see the blood had already drained from his face, and around his midriff was a spreading black stain. His coat pooled around him on the ground. Feebly, he felt for his loose and limp arm with his good hand, and when he looked up at me there was something almost plaintive in his eyes, something pathetic. "Why did you kill him?" I asked evenly. Like water escaping from a leaking flask, he crumpled until he was lying on his side. All that concerned him now was dying. "Tell me," I pressed, and bent close to where he now lay, with pine needles clinging to the blood on his face. He was breathing his last breaths into the mulch of the forest floor. "Your father," he started, then coughed a small gobbet of blood before starting again. "Your father was not a Templar." "I know," I snapped. "Was he killed for that?" I felt my brow furrow. "Was he killed because he refused to join the Order?" "He was an assassin." "And the Templars killed him? They killed him for that?" "No. He was killed for what he had." "What?" I leaned forward, desperate to catch his words. "What did he have?" There was no reply. "Who?" I said, almost shouting. "Who killed him?" But he was out. Mouth open, his eyes fluttered, then closed, and however much I slapped him, he refused to regain consciousness. An assassin. Father was an assassin. I rolled the knife man over, closed his staring eyes, and began to empty his pockets onto the ground. Out came the usual collection of tins, as well as a few tattered bits of paper, one of which I unfurled to find a set of enlistment papers. They were for a regiment, the Coldstream Guards to be precise, 1.5 guineas for joining, then £1 a day. The paymaster's name was on the enlistment papers. It was Lieutenant Colonel Edward Braddock. And Braddock was with his army in the Dutch Republic, taking arms against the French. I thought of the pointy-eared man I'd seen riding out earlier. All of a sudden, I knew where he was heading. 4. I turned and crashed back through the forest to the cabin, making it back in moments. Outside were the 3 horses, grazing patiently in bright sunshine. Inside it was dark and cooler, and Reginald stood over Digweed, whose head lolled as he sat, still tied to the chair, and I knew, from the second I clapped eyes on him. "He's dead," I said simply, and looked at Reginald. "I tried to save him, Hightam, but the poor soul was too far gone." "How?" I said sharply. "Of his wounds," snapped Reginald. "Look at him, man." Digweed's face was a mask of drying blood. His clothes were caked with it. The knife man had made him suffer, that much was certain. "He was alive when I left." "And he was alive when I arrived, damn it!" seethed Reginald. "At least tell me you got something from him." His eyes dropped. "He said he was sorry before he died." With a frustrated swish of my sword, I slammed a beaker into the fireplace. "That was all? Nothing about the night of the attack? No reason? No names? Damn your eyes, Hightam! Damn your eyes! Do you think I killed him? Do you think I came all this way, neglected my other duties, just to see Digweed dead? I wanted to find him as much as you did. I wanted him alive as much as you did." It was as though I could feel my entire skull harden. "I doubt that very much," I spat. "Well, what happened to the other one?" asked Reginald back. "He died." Reginald wore an ironic look. "Oh, I see. And whose fault was that, exactly?" I ignored him. "The killer, he is known to Braddock." Reginald reared back. "Really?" Back at the clearing I'd stuffed the papers into my coat, and I brought them out now in a handful, like the head of a cauliflower. Here, his enlistment papers. He's in the Coldstream Guards under Braddock's command. Hardly the same thing, Hightam. Edward has a force 1,500 strong, many of them enlisted in the country. I'm sure every single man has an unsavoury past, and I'm sure Edward knows very little about it. Even so, a coincidence, don't you think? The storekeeper said they both wore the uniform of the British Army, and my guess is the rider we saw is on his way to them now. He has, what, an hour's head start? I'll not be far behind. Braddock's in the Dutch Republic, is he not? That's where he'll be heading, back to his general. Now careful, Hightam, said Reginald. Steel crept into his eyes and into his voice. Edward is a friend of mine. I've never liked him, I said, with a touch of childish impudence. Oh, pish, exploded Reginald. An opinion formed by you as a boy, because Edward didn't show you the deference you were accustomed to. Because, I might add, he was doing his utmost to bring your father's killers to justice. Let me tell you, Hightam, Edward serves the Order, is a good and faithful servant, and always has been. I turned to him, and it was on the tip of my tongue to say, but wasn't father an assassin? When I stopped myself. Some feeling or instinct, difficult to say what it was, made me decide to keep that information to myself. Reginald saw me do it, saw the words pile up behind my teeth, and maybe even saw the lie in my eyes. The killer, he pressed. Did he say anything else at all? Were you able to drag any more information out of him before he died? Only as much as you could get from Digweed, I replied. There was a small stove at one end of the cabin, and by it a chopping block where I found part of a loaf which I stuffed into my pocket. What are you doing? Said Reginald. Getting what provisions I can for my ride, Reginald. There was a bowl of apples, too. I'd need those for my horse. A stale loaf? Some apples? It isn't enough, Hightam. At least go back to the town for supplies. No time, Reginald, I said. And anyway, the chase will be short. He only has a short head start, and he doesn't know he's being pursued. With any luck, I can catch him before I have need of supplies. We can collect food on the way. I can help you. But I stopped him. I was going alone, I said, and before he could argue, I'd mounted my steed and taken her in the direction I'd seen the pointy-eared man go in, my hopes high I could catch him shortly. They were dashed. I rode hard, but in the end the dark drew in. It had become too dangerous to continue, and I risked injuring my horse. In any case, she was exhausted, so reluctantly I decided to stop and let her rest for a few hours. And as I sit here writing, I wonder why, after all the years of Reginald being like a father to me, a mentor, a tutor, and guide, why did I decide to ride out alone? And why did I keep from him what I discovered about father? Have I changed? Has he changed? Or is it that the bond we once shared has changed? The temperature has dropped. My steed, and it seems only right that I should give her a name, and so, in honour of the way she's already starting to nuzzle me when in need of an apple, I've called her Scratch, lies nearby, her eyes closed, and seems content, and I write in my journal. I think about what Reginald and I talked of. I wonder if he's right to question the man I have become. 15th of July, 1747. I rose early in the morning, as soon as it was light, raked over the dying coals of my fire, and mounted Scratch. The chase continued. As I rode, I mulled over the possibilities. Why had Pointy Ears and the Knife Man gone their separate ways? Were they both intending to journey to the Dutch Republic and join Braddock? Would Pointy Ears be expecting his confederate to catch him up? I had no way of knowing. I could only hope that whatever their plans, the man ahead of me had no idea I was in pursuit. But if he didn't, and how could he, then why wasn't I catching him? And I rode fast but steadily, aware that coming upon him too quickly would be just as disastrous as not catching him at all. After about 3/4 of an hour, I came upon a spot where he had rested. If I'd pushed Scratch for longer, would I have disturbed him, taken him by surprise? I knelt to feel the dying warmth of his fire. To my left, Scratch muzzled something on the ground, a bit of discarded sausage, and my stomach rumbled. Reginald had been right. My prey was much better equipped for the journey than I was, with my half a loaf of bread and apples. I cursed myself for not going through the saddlebags of his companion. "Come on, Scratch," I said. "Come on, girl." For the rest of the day I rode, and the only time I even slowed down was when I retrieved the spyglass from my pocket and scanned the horizon, looking for signs of my quarry. He remained ahead of me, frustratingly ahead of me, all day, until, as light began to fade, I started becoming concerned I had lost him altogether. I could only hope I was right about his destination. In the end, I had no choice but to rest again for the day, make camp, build a fire, allow Scratch to rest, and pray that I hadn't lost the trail. And as I sit here, I wonder, why haven't I managed to catch him? 16th of July, 1747. 1. When I woke up this morning, it was with a flash of inspiration. Of course. Pointy Ears was a member of Braddock's army, and Braddock's army had joined with forces commanded by the Prince of Orange in the Dutch Republic, which was where Pointy Ears should have been. The reason he was hurrying was because he had absconded and was rushing to get back, presumably before his absence was discovered, which meant that his presence in the Black Forest wasn't officially sanctioned, which meant that Braddock, as his lieutenant colonel, didn't know about it. Or probably didn't know about it. Sorry, Scratch. I rode her hard again. It would be her third successive day, and noticed the tiredness in her, the fatigue that slowed her down. Even so, it was only around half an hour before we came upon the remains of Pointy Ears' camp, and this time, instead of stopping to test the embers, I urged Scratch on and only let her rest at the next hilltop, where we stopped as we pulled out the spyglass and scanned the area ahead of us, square by square, inch by inch, until I saw him. There he was, a tiny speck riding up the hill opposite, swallowed up by a clump of trees as I watched. Where were we? I didn't know whether or not we had passed over the border into the Dutch Republic. I hadn't seen another soul for 2 days, had heard nothing but the sound of Scratch and my own breathing. That was soon to change. I spurred Scratch, and some 20 minutes later was entering the same band of trees I'd seen my quarry disappear into. The first thing I saw was an abandoned cart. Nearby, with flies crawling over sightless eyes, was the body of a horse, the sight of which made Scratch rear slightly, startled. Like me, she had been used to the solitude. Just us, the trees, the birds. Here suddenly was the ugly reminder that in Europe one is never far from conflict, never far from war. We rode on more slowly now, being careful among the trees and whatever other obstacles we might find. Moving onwards, more and more of the foliage was blackened, broken, or trampled down. There'd been some action here, that much was certain. I began to see bodies of men, splayed limbs and staring dead eyes, dark blood and mud rendering the corpses anonymous apart from flashes of uniform. The white of the French army, the blue of the Dutch. I saw broken muskets, snapped bayonets and swords, anything of use having already been salvaged. When I emerged from the tree line, we were in a field, the field of battle, where there were even more bodies. Evidently it had been only a small skirmish by the standards of war, but even so, it felt as though death was everywhere. How long ago it had been I couldn't say with certainty. Enough time for scavengers to strip the field of battle, but not enough for the bodies to be removed. Within the last day, I would have thought, judging by the state of the corpses, and the blanket of smoke that still hung over the pasture. A shroud of it, like morning fog, but with a heavy yet sharp scent of gunpowder smoke. Here the mud was thicker, churned up by hooves and feet, and as Scratch began to struggle, I reined her to the side, trying to take us around the perimeter of the field. Then, just as she stumbled in the mud and almost pitched me forward over her neck, I caught sight of pointy ears ahead of us. He was the length of the field away, perhaps half a mile or so, a hazy, almost indistinct figure also struggling in the claggy terrain. His horse must have been as exhausted as mine, because he'd dismounted and was trying to pull it by the reins, his curses carrying faintly across the field. I pulled out my spyglass to get a better look at him. The last time I'd seen him close up was 12 years ago, and he'd been wearing a mask, and I found myself wondering, hoping even, that my first proper look at him might contain some kind of revelation. Would I recognize him? No, he was just a man, weathered and grizzled like his partner had been, filthy and exhausted from his ride. Looking at him now, there was no sense of suddenly knowing. Nothing fell into place. He was just a man, a British soldier, same as the one I had killed in the Black Forest. I saw him crane his neck as he stared through the haze at me. From his coat he produced his own spyglass, and for a moment the two of us studied one another through our telescopes. Then I watched as he ran to the muzzle of his horse, and with renewed vigour began yanking at the reins, at the same time throwing glances back across the field at me. He recognized me. Good. Scratch had regained her feet, and I pulled her to where the ground was a little harder. At last we were able to make some headway. In front of me, Pointy Ears was becoming more distinct, and I could make out the effort on his face as he pulled out his own horse, then saw the realization dawn on him that he was stuck, and I was gaining on him and would be upon him in a matter of a few short moments. And then he did the only thing he could do. He dropped the reins and started to run. At the same time, the verge around us gave way sharply, and once again Scratch was finding it difficult to keep her feet. With a quick and whispered thank you, I jumped from her to give chase on foot. The efforts of the last few days caught up with me in a rush that threatened to engulf me. The mud sucked at my boots, making every step not like running but like wading, and the breath was jagged in my lungs as though I were inhaling grit. Every muscle screamed in protest and pain at me, begging me not to go on. I could only hope that my friend ahead was having it just as hard, even harder perhaps, because the one thing that spurred me on, the one thing that kept my legs pumping and my chest pulling ragged breaths from the air, was the knowledge that I was closing the gap. He glanced behind, and I was close enough to see his eyes widen in fear. He had no mask now, nothing to hide behind. Despite the pain and exhaustion, I grinned at him, feeling dry, parched lips pulling back over my teeth. He pressed on, grunting with the effort. It had begun to rain, a drizzle that gave the day an extra layer of haze, as though we were stuck inside a landscape coloured in charcoal. Again he risked another look behind, and saw that I was even closer now. This time he stopped and drew his sword, held it in two hands with his shoulders slumped, breathing heavily. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who'd spent day after day riding hard with little sleep. He looked like a man waiting to be beaten. But I was wrong. He was luring me forward, and like a fool I fell for it, and in the next instant was stumbling forward, literally falling as the ground gave way, and I waded straight into a vast pool of thick, oozing mud that stopped me in my tracks. "Oh, God," I said. My feet disappeared, then my ankles, and before I knew it I was in up to my knees, desperately yanking at my legs, trying to pull them free, while at the same time bracing myself with one hand on the firmer ground around me, trying to keep my sword raised with the other. My eyes went to Pointy Ears, and it was his turn to grin now, as he came forward and brought his sword down in a chopping two-handed blow that had plenty of force, but was clumsy. With a grunt of effort and a ring of steel I met it and parried, sending him back a couple of steps. Then, as he was off balance, I pulled one of my feet clear of the mud and my boot, saw my white stocking, filthy as it was, bright compared to the dirt around it. Seeing his advantage being squandered, Pointy Ears pressed forward again, this time stabbing forward with his sword, and I defended once and then twice. For a second there was only the sound of clashing steel, of grunts and the rain, harder now, slapping into the mud, me silently thanking God his reserves of cunning were exhausted. Or were they? At last he realized I would be beaten more easily if he moved to the rear of me. But I saw what was on his mind and lashed out with my sword, catching him at the knee just above his boot and sending him crashing back, howling in agony. With a cry of pain and indignity he got to his feet, driven on perhaps by outrage that his victory wasn't being given to him more easily, and kicked out with his good foot. I caught it with my other hand and twisted it as hard as I could, hard enough to send him spinning and sprawling face first to the mud. He tried to roll away, but was too slow or too dazed, and I stabbed downwards with my sword, driving it through the back of his thigh, straight into the ground and spearing him there. At the same time I used the handle as a grip, and with a wrench pulled myself from the mud, leaving my second boot behind. He screamed and twisted, but was held in place by my sword through his leg. My weight on him as I used the sword as leverage to drag myself from the ooze must have been unbearable, and he shrieked in pain, and his eyes rolled back in their sockets. Even so, he slashed wildly with his sword, and I was unarmed, so that as I flopped onto him, like a badly landed fish, the blade caught me on the side of the neck, opening a cut, and letting out blood that felt warm on my skin. My hands went to his, and suddenly we were grappling for possession of the sword. Grunting and cursing we fought, when from behind I heard something that was surely the sound of approaching feet. Then voices, somebody speaking in Dutch. I cursed. "No," said a voice, and I realized it was me. He must have heard it too. "You're too late, Kenway," he snarled. The tramping of the feet from behind me, the rain. My own cries of "No, no, no!" as a voice said in English, "You there, stop at once!" And I twisted away from Pointy Ears, smacking the wet mud in frustration as I pulled myself upright, ignoring the sound of his harsh and jagged laugh as I rose to meet the troops who appeared from within the fog and rain, trying to bring myself to full height as I said, "My name is Hightam Kenway, and I am an associate of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Braddock. I demand this man be given into my custody." The next laugh I heard, I wasn't sure if it came from Pointy Ears, who lay still pinned to the ground, or perhaps from one of the small band of troops who had materialized before me, like wraiths delivered from the field. Of the commander I saw a moustache, a dirty, wet, double-breasted jacket trimmed with sodden braid that had once been the colour gold. I saw him raising something something that seemed to flash across my eye line, and realized he was striking me with the hilt of the sword an instant before he made contact, and I lost consciousness. 2. They don't put unconscious men to death. That would not be noble. Not even in an army commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Braddock. And so the next thing I felt was cold water slapping into my face. Or was it an open palm on my face? Either way, I was being rudely awakened, and as my senses returned, I spent a moment wondering who I was, where I was, and why I had a noose around my neck, and why my arms were tied behind my back. I was at one end of a platform. To my left were 4 men, also like me, with their necks in nooses. As I watched, the man on the far left jerked and juddered, his feet kicking at empty air. A gasp went up in front of me, and I realized that we had an audience. We were no longer in the battlefield, but in some smaller pasture where men had assembled. They wore the colours of the British Army and the bearskin hats of the Coldstream Guards, and their faces were ashen. They were here under sufferance, it was clear, forced to watch as the poor unfortunate at the end of the line kicked his last, his mouth open, and the tip of his tongue, bleeding from having been bitten, protruding, his jaw working in to try and gulp air. He continued to twitch and kick, his body shaking the scaffold, which ran the length of the platform above our heads. I looked up and saw my own noose tied to it, cast my eyes downwards to the wooden stool on which I stood, and saw my feet, my stockinged feet. There was a hush. Just the sound of the hanged man dying, the creak of the rope, and the complaint of the scaffold. "That's what happens when you're a thief!" screeched the executioner, pointing at him, then striding down the platform towards the second man, calling out to the stock-still crowd, "You meet your maker at the end of a rope! Orders of Lieutenant Colonel Braddock!" "I know Braddock," I shouted suddenly. "Where is he? Bring him here!" "Shut your mouth, you!" bawled the executioner, his finger pointed, while at the same time his assistant, the man who'd thrown water in my face, came from my right and slapped me again, only this time not to bring me to my senses, but to silence me. I snarled and struggled with the rope tying my hands, but not too vigorously, not enough so that I would overbalance and fall from the stool on which I was so perilously perched. "My name is Hightam Kenway," I called, the rope digging into my neck. "I said, shut your mouth!" the executioner roared a second time, and again his assistant struck me, hard enough so that he almost toppled me from the stool. For the first time I caught sight of the soldier strung up to my immediate left, and realized who it was. It was Pointy Ears. He had a bandage that was black with blood around his thigh. He regarded me with cloudy, hooded eyes, a slow, sloppy smile on his face. By now the executioner had reached the second man in the line. "This man is a deserter," he screeched. "He left his comrades to die. Men like you. He left you to die. Tell me, what should his punishment be?" Without much enthusiasm, the men called back, "Hang him." "If you say so," smirked the executioner, and he stepped back, planted his foot in the small of the condemned man's back, and pushed, savouring the revolted reaction of the watching men. I shook the pain of the assistant's blow from my head, and continued to struggle just as the executioner reached the next man, asking the crowd the same question, receiving the same muted, dutiful reply, then pushing the poor wretch to his death. The platform quaked and shook as the 3 men jerked on the end of the ropes, Above my head the scaffold creaked and groaned, and glancing up I saw joints briefly part before coming back together again. Next the executioner reached Pointy Ears. This man enjoyed a small sojourn in the Black Forest, and thought he could sneak back undetected. But he is wrong. Tell me, how should he be punished? Hang him, mumbled the crowd unenthusiastically. Do you think he should die? Cried the executioner. Yes, replied the crowd. But I saw some of them surreptitiously shaking their heads no. And there were others, drinking from leather flasks, who looked happier about the whole affair, the way you might if you were being bribed with ale. Indeed, did that account for Pointy Ears' apparent stupor? He was still smiling, even when the executioner moved behind him and planted his foot in the small of his back. It's time to hang a deserter, he shouted, and shoved at the same time as I cried, No! And thrashed at my bonds, desperately trying to break free. No, he must be kept alive! Where is Braddock? Where is Lieutenant Colonel Edward Braddock? The executioner's assistant appeared before my eyes, grinning through a scratchy beard with hardly a tooth in his mouth. Didn't you hear the man? He said. Shut your mouth! And he pulled back his fist to punch me. He didn't get the chance. My legs shot out, knocked the stool away, and in the next instant were locked around the assistant's neck, crossed at the ankle, and tightening. He yelled, I squeezed harder. His yell became a strangulated choke, and his face began to flush as his hands went to my calves, trying to prise them apart. I wrenched from side to side, shaking him like a dog with prey in its jaws, almost taking him off his feet, straining my thigh muscles at the same time as I tried to keep the weight off the noose at my neck. Still at my side, Pointy Ears thrashed on the end of his rope. His tongue poked from between his lips, and his milky eyes bulged as if about to burst from his skull. The executioner had moved to the other end of the platform, where he was pulling on the legs of the hanged men to make sure they were dead, but the commotion at the other end caught his attention, and he looked up to see his assistant trapped in the vice grip of my legs, then came dashing up the platform towards us, cursing at the same time as he reached to draw his sword. With a shout of effort, I twisted my body and wrenched my legs, pulling the assistant with me, and by some miracle timing it just right, so that his body slammed into the executioner as he arrived. With a shout, the executioner tumbled messily from the platform. In front of us the men were standing, open-mouthed with shock, none moving to get involved. I squeezed my legs even more tightly together, and was rewarded with a cracking, crunching sound that came from the assistant's neck. Blood began pouring from his nose. His grip on my arms began to slacken. Again I twisted. Again I shouted as my muscles protested, and I wrenched him, this time to the other side, where I slammed him into the scaffold. The shaking, creaking, coming apart scaffold. It creaked and complained some more. With a final effort, I had no more strength left, and if this didn't work, then here was where I died. I rammed the man into the scaffold again, and this time, at last, it gave. At the same time as I began to feel myself black out, as though a dark veil were being brought across my mind, I felt the pressure at my neck suddenly relax as the support crashed to the ground in front of the platform. The crossbar toppled. Then the platform itself gave way with the sudden weight of men and wood, falling in on itself with a splintering and crashing of disintegrating wood. My last thought before I lost consciousness was, "Please let him be alive." And my first words on regaining consciousness inside the tent, where I now lie, were, "Is he alive?" 3. "Is who alive?" asked the doctor, who had a distinguished-looking moustache, and an accent that suggested he was higher born than most. "The pointy-eared man," I said, and tried to raise myself upright, only to find his hand on my chest, guiding me back down to a lying position. "I'm afraid I haven't the foggiest idea what you're talking about," he said, not unkindly. "I hear that you are acquainted with the Lieutenant Colonel. Perhaps he will be able to explain everything to you when he arrives in the morning." Thus I now sit here, writing up the events of the day, and awaiting my audience with Braddock. 17th of July, 1747. He looked like a larger, smarter version of his men, with all of the bearing that his rank implied. His shining black boots were up to the knee. He wore a frock coat with white trim over a dark, buttoned-up tunic, a white scarf at his neck, and on a thick brown leather belt at his waist hung his sword. His hair was pulled back and tied with a black ribbon. He tossed his hat to a small table at the side of the bed where I lay, put his hands to his hips, and regarded me with that deep, colourless gaze I knew well. "Kenway," he said simply, "Reginald did not send word that you were due to be joining me here." "It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, Edward," I said, suddenly feeling young in his presence, intimidated almost. "I see," he said. "You thought you'd just drop in, did you?" "How long have I been here?" I asked. "How many days have passed?" "3," replied Braddock. "Dr. Tennant was concerned you might develop a fever. According to him, a feebler man may not have been able to fight it off. You're lucky to be alive, Kenway. Not every man gets to escape both the gallows and a fever. Fortunate for you, too, that I was informed about one of the men to be hanged calling for me personally. Otherwise my men might well have finished the job. You see how we punish wrongdoers." I put my hand to my neck, which was bandaged from the fight with Pointy Ears and still painful from the rope burn. "Yes, Edward, I have had first-hand experience of how you treat your men." He sighed, waved away Dr. Tennant, who retired, closing the flaps of the tent behind him, then sat heavily, putting one boot to the bed as though to stake his claim on it. "Not my men, Kenway. Criminals. You were delivered to us by the Dutch in the company of a deserter, a man who had gone absent with a companion. Naturally, you were assumed to be the companion." "And what of him, Edward? What of the man I was with?" "This is the man you've been asking about, is it? The one Dr. Tennant tells me you're especially interested in, what did he say now? A pointy-eared man." He couldn't keep the sneer out of his voice as he said it. "That man, Edward. He was there the night of the attack on my home. He's one of the men we've been seeking these last 12 years. I looked at him hard. "And I find him enlisted in your army." "Indeed, in my army. And what of it?" "A coincidence, don't you think?" Braddock always wore a scowl, but now it deepened. "Why don't you forget the insinuations, boy, and tell me what's really on your mind? Where is Reginald, by the way?" "I left him in the Black Forest. No doubt he's halfway home by now." "To continue his research into myths and folk tales," said Braddock with a contemptuous flick of his eyes. Him doing that made me feel strangely loyal to Reginald and his investigations, despite my own misgivings. Reginald believes that if we were able to unlock the secrets of the storehouse, the Order would be the most powerful it has been since the Holy Wars, perhaps ever. We would be poised to rule completely. He gave a slightly tired, disgusted look. "If you really believe that, then you're as foolish and idealistic as he is. We don't need magic and tricks to persuade people to our cause. We need steel. Why not use both? I reasoned. He leaned forward. Because one of them is a rank waste of time, that's why. I met his gaze. That's as may be. However, I don't think the best way to win men's hearts and minds is to execute them, do you? Again, scum. And has he been put to death? Your friend with, what was it? Pointy ears? Your ridicule means nothing to me, Edward. Your ridicule means as much to me as your respect, which is nothing. You may think you tolerate me only because of Reginald. Well, I can assure you the feeling is entirely mutual. Now tell me, the pointy-eared man, is he dead? He died on the scaffold, Kenway. He died the death he deserved. I closed my eyes, and for a second lay there, aware of nothing but my own... What? Some evil, boiling broth of grief, anger, and frustration, of mistrust and doubt, aware also of Braddock's foot on my bed, and wishing I could lash out with a sword and purge him from my life forever. That was his way, though, wasn't it? It wasn't my way. So he was there that night, was he? Asked Braddock. And did he have a slightly mocking tone in his voice? He was one of those responsible for killing your father. And all of this time he's been among us and we never knew. A bitter irony, wouldn't you say, Hightam? Indeed. An irony or a coincidence. Be careful, boy. There's no Reginald here to talk you out of trouble now, you know. What was his name? Like hundreds of men in my army, his name was Tom Smith. Tom Smith of the country. Much more about them we don't know. On the run, probably from the magistrates, or perhaps having killed his landlord's son in a duel, or deflowered a landowner's daughter, or perhaps romped with his wife. Who's to say? We don't ask questions. If you were to ask, does it surprise me that one of the men we hunted was here among my army all of the time, then my answer would be no. Did he have associates in the army? Somebody that I could talk to? Slowly, Braddock took his foot from my cot. As a fellow knight, you are free to enjoy my hospitality here, and you may of course conduct your own inquiries. I hope that in return I can also call upon your assistance in our endeavours. And what may they be? I asked. The French have laid siege to the fortress of Bergen op Zoom. Inside are our allies, the Dutch, Austrians, Hanoverian and Hessians, and of course the British. The French have already opened the trenches and are digging a second set of parallel trenches. They will soon begin their bombardment of the fortress. They will be trying to take it before the rains. They think it will give them a gateway to the Netherlands, and the Allies feel that the fortress must be held at all costs. We need every man we can get. You see now why we do not tolerate deserters. Do you have a heart for the battle, Kenway? Or are you so focused on revenge that you cannot help us any more?